The Wisconsin dawn broke cold and gray, the kind of morning where frost clung to the fence posts like a stubborn ghost. The air smelled of damp earth and hay, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Out on County Road 17, where the fields stretched wide and lonely, a milk tanker sat abandoned in a ditch, its chrome sides glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. The engine was off, the driver's door ajar, and the only sound was the wind rattling through the cornstalks, their dry husks whispering secrets to no one. Ellie Harper pulled her pickup to a stop, gravel crunching under her tires. She was 28, wiry, with calloused hands that knew the weight of a pitchfork and the bite of a winter milking. Her family's dairy farm, Harper's Hollow, was one of the last small operations in Dane County, stubborn holdouts against the corporate sprawl swallowing the region. She'd been up since 4 a.m., checking the cows, when she spotted the tanker on her way to town. It wasn't right, tankers didn't just sit like that, not on a route as reliable as the morning milk run. She stepped out, her boots sinking into the muddy shoulder. The tanker belonged to Prairie Milk Co-op, its logo faded but unmistakable. Ellie knew the driver, Tommy Vaughn, a lanky 23-year-old with a quick laugh and a habit of blasting country music loud enough to wake the herd. He'd been picking up milk from her farm for 6 months, always on time, always with a grin. But now, his rig was empty, no Tommy, no note, no nothing. The cab smelled of stale coffee and leather, and his thermos lay tipped over on the passenger seat, a dark stain spreading across the floor mat. Ellie's stomach tightened. She scanned the horizon, where the fields met the low hills, their edges blurred by mist. The road stretched empty in both directions, flanked by barbed wire and the occasional gnarled oak. A mile west lay the Kessler Ranch, a sprawling 2,000-acre spread owned by Amos Kessler, a man who didn't take kindly to trespassers. Tommy's route ran right through it, past the rusted gate that marked the boundary between neighborly and hostile. The Kesslers had a reputation. Folks said Amos once chased a surveyor off his land with a shotgun, and his son, Caleb, wasn't much friendlier. "Tommy?" Ellie called, her voice swallowed by the wind. No answer. She circled the tanker, noting the tire tracks veering off the pavement, deep ruts in the mud like the rig had swerved hard. A single boot print, too large for Tommy's scrawny frame, marked the ditch nearby. It was fresh, pressed deep into the clay, with a strange tread pattern she didn't recognize. Her fingers brushed the radio clip to her belt, but she hesitated. Calling the sheriff meant questions, and questions meant trouble with the Kesslers. Still, something was wrong. Tommy wasn't the type to ditch his rig and wander off. Back at Harper's Hollow, Ellie found her father, Walt, in the barn, tinkering with a broken milking pump. At 62, Walt was all sinew and stubbornness, his face weathered like the oak beams overhead. He'd been farming since before Ellie was born, through droughts, blizzards, and the bank's foreclosure threats. He knew every inch of Dane County's soil, every quirk of its weather, and every grudge its people held. Tommy didn't show, Ellie said, leaning against the barn door. The creak of its hinges echoed in the cavernous space, where the scent of hay and manure hung thick. His tanker's in a ditch out on 17, just past the Kessler place. No sign of him. Walt's wrench paused mid-turn. Kessler's land? His gray eyes narrowed. You didn't go poking around, did you? Not yet, Ellie said, though the urge had tugged at her. But something's off. There's a boot print that doesn't match Tommy's, and the rig looks like it was run off the road. Walt set the wrench down, wiping his hands on a rag. Amos Kessler don't like strangers, and he don't like us much either. If Tommy crossed him, could be he's in a bind. He glanced at the barn's open door, where the morning light cast long shadows across the dirt floor. You call the sheriff? Not yet, Ellie admitted. Figured I'd check with you first. Walt grunted, a sound that carried years of distrust for authority. Good. Sheriff's boys'll just stir up a hornet's nest. Let's take a look ourselves, but we keep it quiet. No need to rile Amos, till we know what's what. They drove out in Walt's old Ford, the engine rattling like a loose bolt. The tanker was still there, untouched, its door swinging slightly in the breeze. Walt circled it slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. He crouched by the boot print, squinting at its edges. Too big for Tommy, he muttered. And these treads ain't from no work boot. Looks like something fancy, city kind. Ellie frowned. City? Out here. Dane County wasn't exactly a tourist trap. The nearest town, Black Creek, was a one-stoplight speck with a diner, a feed store, and a bar where farmers swapped complaints over cheap beer. Strangers didn't come through often, and when they did, they didn't linger. Walt stood, his knees creaking. Could be a hired hand. Amos has been bringing in outsiders to work the ranch since Caleb started acting up. Or could be something else. He didn't elaborate, but Ellie caught the unease in his voice. Walt wasn't one for ghost stories, but he'd lived long enough to know the land held secrets, old debts, hidden grudges, things buried deeper than frost. They followed the road toward the Kessler Ranch, parking just shy of the gate. It was a hulking thing, iron and rust, with a faded, "No trespassing" sign bolted to the bars. Beyond it, the land rolled out in waves of grass and scrub, dotted with cattle grazing under a sky that promised rain. The Kessler house sat a half-mile off, a squat, weathered structure dwarfed by a looming red barn. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and gray, like a warning. "We shouldn't be here," Ellie said, her hand resting on the truck's door handle. "If Amos sees us." "We ain't crossing the line," Walt cut in. "Just looking." He pulled a pair of binoculars from the glove box and scanned the horizon. After a moment, he stiffened. "There's movement. By the barn. Looks like Caleb." Ellie took the binoculars. Sure enough, Caleb Kessler was there, hauling a sack toward the barn's side door. He was 30, broad-shouldered, with a temper that matched his father's. The sack looked heavy, dragging slightly in the dirt. Something about the way he moved, quick, furtive, set Ellie's nerves on edge. "Think he knows something?" she asked. "Maybe," Walt said. "But we ain't asking him direct. Not yet." They drove back to the tanker, the silence between them heavy. Ellie couldn't shake the image of that boot print, or the way the tanker's door hung open, like it was waiting for someone to come back. At the farm, they found Lena, Ellie's younger sister, feeding the chickens. At 19, Lena was all bright eyes and restless energy, dreaming of college but tethered to the farm by duty. She'd known Tommy since high school, had even blushed when he'd teased her about her freckles. "Tommy's missing?" Lena's voice cracked when Ellie told her. "He was just here yesterday, joking about how he'd sneak me some of that fancy cheese from the co-op." Her hands twisted in her apron, scattering grain across the dirt. "We don't know he's missing," Walt said, his tone firm but kind. "Could be he broke down and walked for help. No signal out here to call." But Ellie wasn't so sure. Tommy's phone was still in the cab, its screen cracked but glowing with missed calls. And then there was the boot print, too deliberate to be chance. She stepped away from the coupe, her gaze drifting to the fields. The wind carried a faint, rhythmic thud, like a distant hammer or a heartbeat. It was coming from the direction of the Kessler Ranch. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples, Ellie sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold. The farm felt too quiet, the usual hum of the milking machines replaced by an uneasy stillness. Walt was inside, cleaning his rifle, not because he expected trouble, but because it gave his hand something to do. Lena was in her room, her music playing softly through the thin walls. Ellie's eyes kept drifting to the road. She thought of Tommy, his easy smile, the way he'd lean out the tanker's window and call her "boss" just to get a rise. He wasn't family, but he was close enough. And now he was gone, swallowed by the same land that had shaped her life. The thudding sound came again, fainter now, almost lost in the chorus of crickets. She stood, her heart pounding, and walked to the edge of the porch. There, in the dirt by the mailbox, was a single white feather, its edges frayed. It hadn't been there that morning. Ellie picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. It was too large for a sparrow, too pristine for the farm's dusty chaos. Her breath caught as she noticed something else, a smudge of red on the quill, still wet, like blood. Before she could call for Walt, headlights pierced the dusk, slicing through the fields. A truck was coming, fast, from the direction of the Kessler Ranch. Its engine roared, unfamiliar, and as it slowed near the gate, Ellie saw a figure in the driver's seat, a stranger, his face shadowed, but his eyes fixed on her. The headlights cut through the twilight like a blade, pinning Ellie to the porch. The truck idled at the gate, its engine a low growl that set the farm dogs barking. She clutched the white feather, its red-stained quill slick between her fingers, and squinted into the glare. The driver's silhouette was unfamiliar, broad-shouldered, motionless, staring straight at her. Her pulse thrummed, but she forced herself to stand tall. This was Harper's Hollow, her ground. "Ellie, get inside," Walt's voice came sharp from the doorway, his rifle cradled low but ready. Lena hovered behind him, her face pale in the dim light spilling from the house. The dogs' barks turned to snarls, their chains rattling as they strained toward the gate. The truck's engine cut off abruptly, and the silence was worse, thick, heavy, broken only by the faint creak of cornstalks in the wind. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans too clean for farm work. His face caught the porch light, sharp cheekbones, eyes shadowed under a cap, maybe 40. Not a Kessler, not anyone Ellie knew. "Evening," he called, his voice smooth, almost too polite. "Name's Garrett. I'm with Prairie Milk. Heard about Tommy's rig. Thought I'd check in." He stayed by the truck, hands in his pockets, but his posture was too stiff, like he was measuring every move. Walt stepped onto the porch, rifle still low. "You're a ways from the co-op, Garrett. What brings you out here after dark?" Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tommy's one of ours. When he didn't check in, they sent me to look. Found his tanker down on 17, empty. Figured you folks might have seen something, being so close." Ellie's grip tightened on the feather. The co-op didn't send suits to check on drivers, they sent mechanics or other drivers, people who knew the routes. And Garrett's boots, polished, with a tread that looked suspiciously like the print by the tanker, didn't belong on a milk run. "We found the tanker too," she said, keeping her voice steady. "No sign of Tommy. You know anything else?" Garrett's gaze flicked to the feather in her hand, just for a second, before he shrugged. "Not much. Kid's reliable, so it's strange. Could be he wandered off, got lost. This land's tricky at night." He gestured vaguely toward the fields, where the mist was rising, curling like smoke over the corn. "Tommy knows these roads better than most," Walt said, his tone flat. "And he ain't the type to wander." Garrett nodded, like he was conceding the point. "Fair enough. Mind if I take a look around? Might have missed something by the tanker." Ellie exchanged a glance with Walt. Letting a stranger poke around felt wrong, especially one who showed up unannounced with a story that didn't quite fit. But turning him away could mean missing a clue about Tommy. "We'll go with you," she said. "It's our land, after all." Garrett's smile tightened, but he nodded. "Lead the way." They piled into Walt's Ford, the rifle stowed under the seat but within reach. Lena insisted on coming, her jaw set despite the fear in her eyes. The drive to the tanker was short, the headlights carving a path through the dark. The rig sat unchanged, its chrome sides catching the beam like a mirror. Garrett walked the perimeter, his flashlight sweeping the ground, pausing at the boot print Ellie had found earlier. He crouched, studying it, then glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Seen prints like this before?" Ellie asked, watching him closely. "Not around here," Garrett said, standing. "Could be a hunter, maybe. Or someone passing through." He moved toward the cab, his light lingering on the spilled thermos. "Tommy leave anything behind? A note, maybe?" "Nothing we found," Walt said, his voice clipped. Ellie noticed he'd positioned himself between Garrett and the cab, one hand resting near his belt. She scanned the ditch, her eyes catching on something new, a faint trail of crushed grass leading toward the Kessler ranch. It wasn't there that morning, and it wasn't wide enough for a vehicle. Footprints, maybe, or something dragged. "Lena, stay by the truck," Ellie said quietly, motioning her sister back. She followed the trail a few steps, her flashlight picking out more white feathers, small and scattered, like breadcrumbs. They led toward a dry creek bed that snaked through the fields, disappearing into the shadow of the Kesslers' fence line. Her stomach twisted. The creek bed was deep enough to hide a man, or a body. Garrett's light swung toward her. "Find something?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Just grass," Ellie lied, stepping back. "Wind's been rough today." She didn't trust Garrett, not with his city boots and his too smooth answers. But the feathers, the trail, they were clues, and they pointed straight to the Kessler ranch. Back at the farm, Garrett left with a promise to report back to the co-op. Walt watched his taillights vanish, then turned to Ellie. "He's no milkman. Those boots, that jacket, he's got money behind him. And he was too interested in that print." Lena, still clutching her sweater, spoke up. "What if Tommy's out there? In the creek bed, or worse?" Her voice trembled, and Ellie pulled her into a quick hug, feeling the weight of her sister's fear. "We'll find him," Ellie said, though the words felt hollow. "But we need to be smart. Whoever left those feathers, they're not far." The next morning, Ellie and Walt headed to the creek bed at first light. The air was heavy with the scent of dew and clover, the fields glowing gold under a reluctant sun. The trail of crushed grass was still there, faint but unmistakable, leading to a narrow gully where the creek had dried to cracked mud. Walt moved slowly, his eyes scanning the ground like he was reading a map. He'd tracked deer and lost calves his whole life. If anyone could follow a trail, it was him. "Here," he said, kneeling by a patch of mud. Another boot print, same tread as before, pressed alongside a smaller one, Tommy's size, maybe. Nearby, a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush, blue and frayed, like the flannel Tommy always wore. Ellie's heart sank. She tucked the fabric into her pocket, her fingers brushing the feather she'd kept from last night. "These tracks head toward Kessler's barn," Walt said, his voice low. "But we can't just stroll up there. Amos'll have our hides." Ellie nodded, her mind racing. The Kesslers were private, but this was beyond their usual hostility. If Tommy had crossed their land, intentionally or not, something had gone wrong. And Garrett, his sudden appearance felt like no coincidence. Was he covering for someone, or looking for Tommy himself? They decided to visit Black Creek's diner, the closest thing to a town hub, to see if anyone had heard from Tommy. The diner smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee, its linoleum floor sticky underfoot. May, the waitress who'd served every farmer in Dane County for 30 years, leaned on the counter, her apron stained with ketchup. "Tommy? Ain't seen him since yesterday morning," she said, pouring Walt a coffee. "He was in here, talking about some new guy at the co-op, said he didn't trust him." "New guy?" Ellie pressed. "Like a driver?" May shrugged. "Didn't say. Just said the fella was asking too many questions about the routes. Got Tommy all worked up." Ellie exchanged a glance with Walt. "Garrett, maybe? Or someone else pulling strings?" Before she could ask more, the diner's door jingled, and Caleb Kessler walked in. He was all muscle and scowl, his boots caked with mud. He didn't look at them, just took a seat at the far end of the counter, but Ellie noticed his hands, clenched tight, knuckles bruised. Back at the farm, Ellie couldn't sit still. The feathers, the fabric, the tracks, they all pointed to the Kessler ranch, but confronting Amos or Caleb without proof was asking for trouble. She decided to check the creek bed again, alone this time, while Walt stayed with Lena. The gully was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of her boots on the dry earth. She followed the trail to where it crossed the Kessler's fence, a low barbed wire line half buried in weeds. There, caught on a barb, was another feather, this one larger, with a streak of red that wasn't blood but paint, bright and deliberate. Ellie froze. The paint was fresh, the feather placed like a marker. She scanned the field, her breath catching as she spotted a figure in the distance, near the Kessler barn. It wasn't Caleb or Amos, it was Garrett, his dark jacket unmistakable, crouching by a pile of hay bales. He was holding something small, glinting in the sunlight. A knife? A key? Before she could move, he stood, turned, and looked straight at her, his eyes locking on hers across the field. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as Garrett's gaze pinned her across the field. The distance between them, maybe 100 yards, felt like nothing under the weight of his stare. The glinting object in his hand vanished into his pocket, and he turned, disappearing behind the Kessler's barn as if he'd never been there. The wind picked up, rattling the dry cornstalks, and the painted feather in Ellie's hand felt heavier, its red streak vivid against the pale quill. She backed away from the fence, her heart hammering, and retraced her steps along the creek bed, the gully's shadow stretching long and jagged in the late morning light. Back at Harper's Hollow, Ellie found Walt in the barn, sharpening a scythe with slow, deliberate strokes. The air smelled of oil and hay, and the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone grounded her nerves. She showed him the feather, its paint still tacky, and recounted Garrett's appearance by the barn. "He saw me," she said, her voice low. "He was holding something, metal, maybe a knife. And he didn't look surprised to be caught." Walt's hand stilled, his eyes narrowing as he studied the feather. "Paint's fresh," he muttered. "Ain't no bird leaving these. Someone's marking a trail, or sending a message." He set the scythe down, its blade catching the light. "Garrett's no co-op man. He's got a purpose, and it ain't finding Tommy." Lena appeared at the barn door, her arms crossed tight. "You think the Kesslers are involved?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Tommy wouldn't go near their place unless he had to. Everyone knows Amos is half crazy about his land." "Could be Tommy didn't have a choice," Ellie said, her mind flashing to the boot print, the torn flannel. Those tracks in the creek bed, Tommy's size, mixed with that other one. Someone was with him, or after him. Walt stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "We need to know what's happening on that ranch, but we can't just walk up and ask. Amos'll shoot first and call it trespassing later." He paused, his gaze drifting to the fields. "There's an old irrigation ditch runs parallel to their fence line. Used to be part of our land before the Kesslers bought it up. It's overgrown, but it'll get you close to the barn without being seen." Ellie nodded, the plan forming. "I'll go tonight. Moon's half full, enough light to see, not enough to be spotted." She didn't mention the knot in her stomach, the way Garrett's stare had felt like a warning. Lena stepped forward, her jaw set. "I'm coming too. Tommy's my friend. I can't just sit here." No, Walt said, his tone final. You stay put. If something goes wrong, I need you here to call May or the sheriff. Lena started to protest, but Walt raised a hand. That's the deal, kid. That evening, as the sky bled orange into dusk, Ellie set out alone. She wore a dark jacket and carried a flashlight, its beam kept low to avoid drawing eyes. The irrigation ditch was a tangle of weeds and mud, its banks steep and slick. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the distant lowing of cattle carried from the Kessler ranch. Ellie moved carefully, her boots sinking into the soft ground, the painted feather tucked in her pocket beside the scrap of Tommy's flannel. The ditch ran close to the Kessler's barn, its red walls looming like a fortress against the darkening sky. Ellie crouched low, her breath shallow, as she scanned the area. The barn's side door was ajar, a faint light flickering inside, maybe a lantern or a bulb swinging on a frayed cord. She heard voices, low and clipped, but couldn't make out the words. One was deep, rough, Amos, probably. The other was smoother, unfamiliar. Garrett? She edged closer, her heart pounding, and peered through a gap in the barn's weathered boards. Inside, Amos Kessler stood by a workbench, his gray hair wild under a battered hat. He was gesturing angrily, his hands thick with calluses, while Caleb leaned against a stack of hay bales, his face shadowed but tense. A third man, Garrett, stood near the back, his jacket off, revealing a crisp white shirt that looked out of place in the barn's grime. He was holding a small metal box, its surface glinting in the lantern light. You said this'd be clean, Amos growled, his voice carrying through the gap. Now I got a missing driver and folks sniffing around my land. I don't need this heat. It's under control, Garrett said, his tone calm but edged. The kid saw too much. We had to move fast. You want your cut, you keep quiet. Ellie's blood ran cold. Tommy saw too much? Her fingers tightened around the flashlight, its weight grounding her as she strained to hear more. Caleb shifted, his boots scuffing the dirt floor. What about the girl? Harper's kid. She was out by the creek today. Garrett's head snapped up. Ellie? She's a problem. If she's poking around, we need to steer her off. Or deal with her. Ellie's stomach lurched. She ducked lower, her pulse roaring in her ears. The barn door creaked, and she froze, expecting footsteps, but none came. Instead, a new sound reached her, a faint, rhythmic thud, like the one she'd heard the night before, coming from somewhere deeper in the barn. It wasn't a hammer or a heartbeat. It was deliberate, like someone tapping for attention. She crept along the ditch, following the sound. It led to a corner of the barn where the foundation sank into the earth, half covered by weeds. There, hidden under a tarp, was a rusted grate, its bars caked with dirt. The thudding came from below, muffled but insistent. Ellie's breath hitched. A cellar? The Kessler's barn was old, built before her time, but she'd never heard of a cellar. She lifted the tarp, wincing as it rustled, and shone her flashlight through the grate. The beam caught something pale, a hand, bruised and trembling, pressed against the underside of the bars. Tommy, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The hand jerked, and a faint voice rasped back, Ellie? Get me out, please. It was Tommy, his words slurred, like he was hurt or exhausted. Before she could respond, footsteps crunched behind her, heavy and deliberate. She spun, her flashlight beam landing on Caleb Kessler's face, his eyes cold and unyielding. What the hell you doing here, Harper? He growled, his hand resting on a knife sheathed at his belt. Ellie's mind raced. She could run, but the ditch was a trap, too narrow, too slippery. She could scream, but no one would hear her this far out. Instead, she forced her voice steady. Looking for Tommy. His tanker's in a ditch, and I found his flannel by the creek. You know anything about that? Caleb's jaw tightened, his hand twitching toward the knife. You're on my land. That's trespassing. Get gone, or I'll drag you to Amos myself. Ellie held her ground, her flashlight steady on his face. If Tommy's hurt, you're in deeper than trespassing. Let me go, Caleb, or this gets loud. For a moment, they stood locked, the wind hissing through the weeds. Then Caleb stepped back, his expression unreadable. Go home, Ellie. And keep your mouth shut. He turned and strode toward the barn, leaving her alone in the dark. Ellie stumbled back through the ditch, her mind reeling. Tommy was alive, trapped, but alive. The cellar, the metal box, Garrett's words, it all pointed to something bigger than a missing driver. But what? And why was Caleb letting her walk away? Her flashlight caught another feather, tucked into the ditch's bank, its red paint glowing like a warning. She left it there, her hands shaking as she climbed into her truck. Back at the farm, she told Walt and Lena everything: Tommy's voice, the cellar, Garrett's talk of a cut. Walt's face darkened, his fingers tracing the edge of his rifle. Sounds like they're hiding something valuable. Could be why Tommy's locked up, he saw it, whatever it is. Lena's eyes widened. We have to get him out. Tonight. Not tonight, Walt said. We need a plan. Amos has guns, and Garrett's no amateur. We go in blind, we're done. Ellie nodded, but her mind was already on the cellar, on Tommy's trembling hand. She couldn't wait long, not with Garrett circling and Caleb watching. As she stepped onto the porch, the thudding sound echoed again, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from the Kessler ranch. And then, closer, a new sound, a low, mechanical hum, like an engine idling just beyond the tree line. The hum of the engine lingered in the night air, a low, insistent drone that set Ellie's nerves on edge. She stood frozen on the porch, the wind carrying the scent of diesel and damp earth. The sound was coming from the tree line beyond Harper's Hollow, where the farm's fields gave way to a dense thicket of pines and brambles. It wasn't a tractor or a milk tanker, too quiet, too deliberate. Her hand tightened around the painted feather in her pocket, its red streak a reminder of the danger closing in. Walt, she called softly, not taking her eyes off the dark. Her father stepped out, his rifle a familiar weight in his hands. Lena followed, clutching a kitchen knife she'd grabbed in a moment of panic. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by the rustle of branches and the distant bark of a dog. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be seen. Stay here, Walt said, his voice low. I'll check the perimeter. He moved toward the tree line, his boots silent on the grass, blending into the shadows like he'd been born to them. Ellie wanted to follow, but Lena's trembling hand on her arm kept her rooted. They waited, the silence stretching until Walt returned, his face grim. Tracks, he said, holding up a flashlight. Tire marks, fresh, leading into the woods. Not a truck, something smaller, like an ATV. They stopped short of the clearing. He paused, his eyes flicking to the feather in Ellie's hand. Whoever it is, they're watching us. Ellie's stomach churned. Tommy was trapped in the Kessler cellar, Garrett was circling with his metal box, and now someone was staking out their farm. The pieces didn't fit, but they all pointed to the ranch. We can't wait, she said. Tommy's hurt. If we don't move soon, they'll move him, or worse. Walt nodded, but his jaw was tight. We need to know what they're hiding. That box Garrett had, it's the key. Could be money, drugs, or something else. Tommy saw it, and that's why he's locked up. Lena's voice broke the tension. What if it's not just the Kesslers? Garrett's not from around here. What if he's working for someone bigger? Ellie met her sister's eyes, the thought sinking in. The co-op was small, local, nobody sent city types like Garrett to check on a missing driver. And those painted feathers, the strange boot prints, they felt staged, like someone was playing a game. But why? The next morning, Ellie and Walt decided to dig deeper, but carefully. Confronting the Kesslers head-on was suicide, and Garrett was too slippery to trust. Instead, they headed to Black Creek's feed store, where farmers swapped gossip as freely as grain. The store smelled of molasses and dust, its shelves stacked with sacks of feed and rusted tools. Old man Pritchard, who'd run the place since before Ellie was born, leaned on the counter, his glasses fogged with steam from his coffee. Tommy Vaughn? Pritchard scratched his beard. Heard he didn't make his run. Folks are saying he got drunk and crashed that tanker. Wouldn't be the first time a young un got sloppy. Tommy doesn't drink, Ellie said, her tone sharper than intended. And his tanker was run off the road. We found tracks, and a piece of his shirt by the Kessler place. Pritchard's eyes narrowed. Kesslers, huh? Amos has been acting strange lately. Been buying up fencing wire and padlocks like he's fortifying a castle. And that son of his, Caleb, saw him in here last week, asking about soil testers. Odd, for a cattleman. Soil testers? Walt frowned. They ain't planting crops. What's he testing for? Pritchard shrugged. Didn't say. But he paid cash, and he was in a hurry. Looked nervous, too. Ellie's mind raced. Soil testers, padlocks, a hidden cellar, it all pointed to something buried, something the Kesslers didn't want found. Back at the farm, she and Walt pored over an old county map, its edges yellowed and curling. The Kessler Ranch sprawled across the western edge of Dane County, butting up against a stretch of federal land that had been untouched for decades. The creek bed where Ellie found Tommy's flannel ran through both properties, a natural boundary that hadn't been surveyed in years. Could be they're hiding something in that cellar, Walt said, tracing the creek's path with a calloused finger. Something worth locking a man up for. Ellie nodded, her thoughts on the metal box. We need to get into that barn. Tonight. If Tommy's still there, we can't leave him. Walt hesitated, then sighed. All right. But we go together, and we go armed. If Garrett's there, or Amos, we don't take chances. That night, under a sky heavy with clouds, Ellie and Walt crept back to the irrigation ditch. The air was damp, carrying the sharp tang of rain and pine. They moved silently, Walt's years of tracking game keeping their steps light. The Kessler barn loomed ahead, its red paint peeling like old blood. The side door was shut now, no light leaking through, but the faint thudding sound Ellie had heard before echoed again, weaker, like a fading pulse. They reached the rusted grate by the barn's foundation, the tarp still pulled aside from Ellie's last visit. Walt shone his flashlight through the bars, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The air rising from below was cold, smelling of mildew and something metallic, like copper or iron. Tommy? Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. A faint groan answered, followed by a weak tap. He was still there. Walt tested the grate, but it was bolted tight, the lock new and gleaming. We need a crowbar, he muttered. Or bolt cutters. Before Ellie could respond, a twig snapped behind them. They spun, Walt's rifle up, as a figure emerged from the ditch. It was May, the diner waitress, her face pale under a wool cap. She held up her hands, a flashlight trembling in one. Don't shoot, she whispered. I followed you. I know about Tommy. Ellie's jaw dropped. May? What the hell? I heard you at the diner, May said, her voice low but urgent. I know the Kesslers. Amos came in last week, talking about some deal with a city man. Said it'd make him rich, but he was scared. Kept mentioning the cash. I think it's in that cellar. Walt lowered the rifle slightly, his eyes narrowing. Why didn't you say something earlier? May's lips tightened. Because I owe Amos. He helped me keep the diner when the bank came calling. But if Tommy's hurt, I can't stay quiet. I brought these. She pulled a pair of bolt cutters from her coat, their handles worn but sturdy. Ellie's mind reeled. May, quiet, no nonsense May, sneaking out to help? It didn't add up, but the bolt cutters were real, and Tommy's groans were growing fainter. Walt took the cutters, his expression unreadable, and set to work on the lock. The grate groaned as it opened, revealing the staircase, its steps slick with moss. They descended, the air growing colder, heavier. At the bottom, the cellar was a cramped, stone-walled room, lit by a single flickering bulb. Tommy lay slumped against the wall, his face bruised, his flannel torn. He was conscious, barely, his eyes fluttering as Ellie knelt beside him. Tommy, it's me, she said, her voice cracking. We're getting you out. He mumbled something, his words slurred. Box, they took it, under the hay, his head lolled, and Ellie's heart sank. He needed a doctor, fast. Walt scanned the cellar, his flashlight catching on a pile of crates in the corner. One was open, empty, but the dirt beneath it was disturbed, like something had been dug up. The cash, he said, his voice low. Whatever it is, they moved it. May hovered by the stairs, her flashlight shaking. We need to go. If Amos finds us. She didn't finish. A shadow fell across the staircase, and Garrett's voice cut through the dark. Too late for that. He stood at the top, a pistol in his hand, its barrel glinting. You Harpers are persistent, I'll give you that. But you're in way over your head. Ellie froze, her hand on Tommy's shoulder. Walt raised his rifle, but Garrett's gun was already trained on him. May's face went white, her bolt cutters clattering to the floor. The cellar felt smaller, the walls closing in, as Garrett descended a step, his eyes cold. Hand over the kid, he said. And maybe you walk out of here. Ellie's mind raced. The empty crate, Tommy's words, the painted feathers, it all pointed to something hidden, something worth killing for. But what? And why was May here, really? Her eyes flicked to the waitress, whose hands were trembling but whose face held a strange, fleeting calm. Something wasn't right. Before she could speak, a loud crash echoed from above, followed by the bellow of Amos Kessler's voice. Who's in my barn? Footsteps thundered, and Garrett's head snapped up, his gun wavering. Ellie's heart pounded. They were trapped, unless they could turn the chaos to their advantage. The crash above reverberated through the cellar, a splintering sound like wood giving way under force. Amos Kessler's bellow followed, raw and furious, shaking the stone walls. Who's in my barn? His voice was a thunderclap, closer now, his boots pounding the floorboards overhead. Garrett's pistol wavered, his eyes darting to the staircase as he backed up a step, his calm facade cracking. Ellie crouched beside Tommy, her hand on his clammy forehead, her mind racing. Walt's rifle was steady, trained on Garrett, but the cellar was a trap, stone walls, one exit, and Amos descending like a storm. "Stay back," Garrett snapped, his gun swinging between Walt and the staircase. His city polish was gone, replaced by a coiled tension that made him unpredictable. May stood frozen, her flashlight casting jittery shadows, her face a mask of fear, or something else. Ellie's gut twisted. May's presence still didn't add up, her story about owing Amos, the bolt cutters, the way she'd slipped into the ditch unnoticed. Was she helping, or was she part of this? Tommy groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Ellie, the box, it's not what you think." His voice was weak, barely audible, but it cut through the chaos. Ellie leaned closer, her heart pounding. "What's in it, Tommy? What did you see?" Before he could answer, the cellar door slammed open, and Amos Kessler loomed at the top of the stairs, a shotgun cradled in his arms. His face was a storm of rage, his gray hair wild under his hat, his eyes locking on Ellie like she was a trespassing coyote. "Harper's," he spat. "Should have known you'd stick your noses where they don't belong." Walt stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "Put the gun down, Amos. We're here for Tommy. He's hurt, and you know why." Amos's gaze flicked to Tommy, then to Garrett, and something shifted in his expression, anger, yes, but also a flicker of fear. "You don't know what you're messing with," he growled. "This ain't your business." "Then tell us," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing her chest. "What's in that box? Why's Tommy locked up? And what's Garrett got to do with it?" Garrett's lips curled into a thin smile, but his eyes were cold. "You're asking the wrong questions, Ellie. The box is just a piece. The real question is who owns the land it was buried on." Ellie's breath caught. The land? The Kessler Ranch bordered federal property, a stretch of untamed hills and gullies that had been ignored for decades. Rumors had swirled for years, old claims of mineral deposits, abandoned mines, even whispers of smuggler caches from the Prohibition days. But nothing had ever been proven. Until now? Amos's shotgun dipped slightly, his voice low. "You're working for them, ain't you, Garrett? Those city bastards who want my land. You set this up, Tommy, the feathers, all of it." Garrett's smile vanished. "You're out of your depth, old man. You think you can keep this quiet?" The kid saw the survey markers. He was gonna talk. Ellie's mind reeled. Survey markers? The soil testers Pritchard mentioned, the padlocks, the painted feathers, it all clicked into a new shape. The Kesslers weren't just hiding a box, they were hiding what it pointed to. Something buried on their land, something valuable enough to lock Tommy in a cellar and draw blood. But Garrett's words, working for them, meant this wasn't just Amos and Caleb. There was someone else, someone bigger, pulling strings from outside Dane County. Before anyone could speak, Tommy lurched forward, his voice hoarse but desperate. "It's not gold, it's bones. Human bones. I saw them, under the hay, they dug them up." His words trailed off as he collapsed, his breathing shallow. Ellie's blood ran cold. Bones? The cellar seemed to shrink, the air thick with mildew and dread. Walt's rifle wavered, his face pale. Amos's shotgun clattered to the floor, his hands trembling. "You're lying," he whispered, but his voice cracked, like he was trying to convince himself. Garrett laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Bones, kid? That's your story?" He stepped closer, his pistol steady now. "You're half dead and still causing trouble. Those aren't just bones, they're leverage. Proof of who really owns this land. And I'm not letting a bunch of farmers ruin a multi-million-dollar deal." The truth hit Ellie like a freight train. The box, the survey markers, the secrecy, it wasn't about gold or drugs. It was about history, buried and forgotten, tied to the land's title. Bones meant a claim, maybe Native American, maybe settler, maybe something darker. If they were old enough, valuable enough, they could challenge the Kesslers' ownership, opening the door for developers or speculators. Garrett wasn't with the co-op, he was a fixer, sent to secure the find and silence anyone who got in the way. "You set Tommy up," Ellie said, her voice shaking with fury. "You ran his tanker off the road, planted those feathers to throw us off. Why?" Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Because he was nosy. Saw the dig site when he cut through the ranch. Thought he'd play hero and tell the world. Bad move." Amos lunged, his fists clenched. "You used me. Told me it was just artifacts, some old junk. Not this." His voice broke, and Ellie saw it, guilt, raw and heavy, in his eyes. Amos hadn't known the full truth, but he'd known enough to lock Tommy away. Walt seized the moment, stepping forward, his rifle trained on Garrett. Drop the gun. Now. Garrett hesitated, his gaze flicking to the staircase, but May moved faster. She grabbed the bolt cutters from the floor and swung, catching Garrett's wrist. The pistol fell, skittering across the stone. Walt kicked it into the corner, but before anyone could move, Caleb's voice roared from above. "Dad! What's going on down there?" Footsteps thundered, and Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs, a rifle in his hands. His eyes widened at the scene. Tommy slumped against the wall, Ellie and Walt armed, May clutching the bolt cutters, and Garrett disarmed but still dangerous. "You brought them here?" Caleb snarled at his father. "It wasn't me," Amos said, his voice hollow. "It was him." He pointed at Garrett, who was backing toward the crates, his hands raised but his eyes calculating. Ellie's heart pounded. They were out of time. Tommy needed help, and Caleb's rifle was a wild card. She knelt beside Tommy, checking his pulse, weak but steady, and whispered, "Hang on, we're getting you out." She looked up at Walt, who nodded, his rifle still on Garrett. "May, help me with Tommy," Ellie said, her voice firm. May hesitated, then moved to Tommy's side, her hands shaking as she helped lift him. But as they started for the stairs, Caleb blocked the way, his rifle swinging between them. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low. "Not with him." "Caleb, listen," Ellie said, her hands raised. "Tommy's hurt. Whatever's going on, he doesn't deserve this. Let us go, and we'll figure this out together." Caleb's eyes flickered to his father, then to Garrett, who was inching toward the crates. "You don't get it," Caleb said. "Those bones, they're not just old. They're ours. Family. Buried to hide what happened a century ago. If they get out, we lose everything." Ellie's breath caught. The Kesslers weren't protecting treasure, they were protecting a secret, one tied to their bloodline. A scandal, a crime, something so dark it had been buried under their land for generations. Garrett had used it, leveraged it, to pressure Amos into compliance. And Tommy had stumbled into the middle. Before she could respond, Garrett lunged for the crates, pulling a small knife from his sleeve. Walt fired a warning shot, the crack echoing in the cellar, but Garrett was fast, diving behind the crates. The air exploded with chaos, Caleb shouting, Amos grabbing his shotgun, May screaming for everyone to stop. Ellie hauled Tommy toward the stairs, her muscles burning, as Walt covered her. They reached the barn floor, the night air cold and sharp. The red walls loomed, the hay bales casting jagged shadows under the moonlight. Tommy was heavy, his breathing ragged, but Ellie kept moving, May at her side. Walt followed, his rifle trained on the cellar door as Caleb's shouts echoed below. They stumbled toward the ditch, the farm a distant glow on the horizon. But as they reached the fence line, headlights flared, cutting through the dark. An ATV roared into view, its engine the same hum Ellie had heard the night before. The driver was masked, a black scarf covering their face, but their build was familiar, lean, wiry, not Caleb or Amos. They stopped short, engine idling, and tossed something into the grass, a white feather, its red paint gleaming. Ellie froze, Tommy's weight dragging at her arms. The ATV revved and sped off, vanishing into the fields. Walt grabbed the feather, his face grim. "They're taunting us," he said. "And they're not done." Behind them, the barn door slammed open, and Caleb's silhouette filled the frame, his rifle raised. "You're not getting away that easy," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Caleb's silhouette loomed in the barn doorway, his rifle a dark slash against the moonlit sky. The air was thick with the scent of hay and impending rain, the Kessler Ranch a maze of shadows and secrets. Ellie's arms burned as she supported Tommy, his weight dragging her toward the ditch, his shallow breaths a reminder of how little time they had. Walt stood firm, his rifle trained on Caleb, while May clutched the bolt cutters, her face pale but resolute. The painted feather in the grass, tossed by the masked ATV driver, glowed like a warning in the dark. "Caleb, don't do this," Ellie called, her voice steady despite the fear clawing her chest. "Tommy needs a doctor. Whatever you're hiding, it's not worth a life." Caleb's rifle wavered, his eyes darting between Ellie and the barn, where shouts and scuffling echoed from the cellar. Amos and Garrett were still down there, their voices a tangle of accusations and threats. "You don't understand," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "Those bones, if they get out, our name's ruined. The land's gone. Everything my family built, gone." Walt stepped forward, his rifle steady. "Your family's been hiding a murder, Caleb. That's what those bones are, ain't it? Someone killed a long time ago, buried to keep it quiet. You think that's worth more than Tommy?" Caleb's jaw tightened, his grip on the rifle faltering. Ellie saw it, the weight of a century-old secret, passed down like a curse. The Kesslers weren't just protecting their land, they were guarding a shame so deep it had warped them. But Caleb wasn't Amos. His eyes held doubt, not rage. Before Ellie could speak, a sharp crack rang out from the cellar, a gunshot. Caleb spun, his rifle dropping as he bolted back inside. Ellie didn't wait. "Go," she hissed, hauling Tommy toward the ditch with May's help. Walt covered their retreat, his flashlight sweeping the field for the ATV or its driver. The hum of its engine was gone, but the painted feather burned in Ellie's mind, a taunt, a marker, a piece of the puzzle still missing. They reached Walt's truck, parked a quarter-mile away in the cover of the pines. Tommy was barely conscious, his face gray, his flannel soaked with sweat. Ellie slid him into the back seat, her hands shaking as she checked his pulse. "Hang on, Tommy," she whispered, climbing in beside him. May took the passenger seat, her bolt cutters clutched like a lifeline, while Walt gunned the engine, the tires spitting gravel as they sped toward Black Creek. The hospital was a 20-minute drive, each second ticking like a bomb. Ellie kept pressure on a gash on Tommy's arm, her mind racing. The bones, Garrett's deal, the Kesslers' desperation, it all pointed to a cover-up, but the ATV driver was the wild card. Who were they? And why mark their path with feathers? At the hospital, nurses rushed Tommy to the ER, his condition critical but stable. Ellie, Walt, and May sat in the waiting room, the fluorescent lights harsh against the night's chaos. Walt called the sheriff, his voice low as he recounted the cellar, the bones, and Garrett's involvement. Ellie watched May, who sat silent, her hands twisting in her lap. "May," Ellie said softly, "why were you really there tonight? You didn't just follow us." May's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Ellie saw guilt. I knew more than I said," May admitted, her voice barely audible. "Years ago, Amos told me about the bones. His great-grandfather killed a man, a drifter who claimed part of the land. They buried him to keep it quiet. I thought it was just a story, but when Tommy went missing, and Amos started acting strange, I knew it was real. I couldn't let you walk into that alone." Ellie's chest tightened. May had been protecting them, but also protecting Amos, caught between loyalty and conscience. Before she could respond, the sheriff arrived, a grizzled man named Hargrove, his badge glinting under the hospital lights. "Kessler Ranch is a mess," he said, rubbing his neck. "We found Amos and Garrett in the cellar. Amos shot him, claims it was self-defense. Garrett's alive, barely. Says he's working for a real estate firm out of Chicago. They wanted the land for a development deal, figured the bones could force a federal claim and void the Kesslers' title." "And the bones?" Walt asked. "Old," Hargrove said. "Likely from the 1880s. We're sending them to a lab, but they're human, all right. Could be native, could be settler. Either way, it's a legal nightmare for the Kesslers." Ellie's mind flashed to Caleb's words, "Everything my family built, gone." "What about Caleb?" she asked. "Ran off," Hargrove said. "We've got deputies searching, but that ranch is a maze. Could be he's hiding, or he's gone for good." Ellie thought of the ATV, the masked driver, the feather. Caleb? Or someone else tied to Garrett's deal? She handed Hargrove the painted feather, explaining the trail they'd found. "Someone's been leaving these," she said. "Marking the way, maybe to throw us off." Hargrove turned the feather over, frowning. "Could be a distraction. Or a signature. We'll look into it." Days later, Tommy was stable, his bruises fading, his story piecing together. He'd cut through the Kessler Ranch to avoid a roadblock, spotted Garrett and Amos digging near the barn, and saw the bones, skulls, ribs, wrapped in burlap. When he tried to leave, Garrett ran his tanker off the road, and Caleb locked him in the cellar, torn between fear and his father's orders. The feathers, Tommy said, were Garrett's idea, a way to make the disappearance look like a prank, to buy time. The Kesslers' ranch was cordoned off, federal agents swarming the fields, their survey equipment glinting in the sun. Amos was in custody, facing charges for kidnapping and attempted murder. Garrett was recovering, his Chicago bosses distancing themselves, claiming he acted alone. Caleb was still missing, the ATV tracks leading to a dead end in the federal hills. Ellie stood on the porch of Harper's Hollow, the air crisp with autumn's first chill. The farm felt quieter now, the fields stretching wide and empty under a gray sky. Lena was inside, baking bread, her way of coping. Walt was in the barn, repairing the milking pump, his hands steady but his eyes distant. The weight of what they'd uncovered, murder, greed, a family shame, hung heavy, but so did the strength it took to face it. Ellie pulled the last feather from her pocket, its red paint faded now. She'd kept it, a reminder of the cost of secrets, of how they fester in the land and the people who work it. The lesson wasn't simple, but it was clear: truth, even when it hurts, is the only way to keep the ground beneath you solid. She tossed the feather into the wind, watching it spiral toward the fields, and turned back to the house. As she stepped inside, a faint hum echoed from the tree line, the same ATV engine, low and fleeting. She froze, scanning the dark, but saw nothing. The sound faded, leaving only the rustle of cornstalks and a question that lingered like frost: who was still out there, watching?